BookTube, I was wrong. Yes, these are 7 books that I was wrong about. I've probably been wrong about a lot more, but here are 7 books that I admit my first impressions were the wrong one. So a lot of times our attitudes change about books over time. I think a lot of times we're in kind of a hurry to get our reviews out, at least on GOODREADS. For me, I always post a GOODREADS review within a day or two of finishing a book. Oftentimes, my thoughts don't come until weeks later, and even in sometimes those few weeks, my rating may change and some of the thoughts on the books may change. Well, these are 7 books that my thoughts changed dramatically through time. Now, a couple of these are natural to happen because I read them as a youth and then reread them as an adult and my total attitude was changed. But some of these, just over a period of months or years or even just weeks with a couple of these, my thoughts changed dramatically. So here are 7 books that I freely admit my first impression was the wrong one. And I want to start with the book that really was the impetus for me wanting to do this video. It was a book I read 2 years ago, and that is Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. When I read Childhood's End, I think I gave it 3 stars. I liked it, didn't love it, didn't understand why it was this monumental classic that people rave about. Childhood's End is told in 3 parts, and the first part is humanity basically realizing that we're not alone in the universe. Some aliens contact us and say, hey, we're going to be there in 50 years, clean up your act, and we'll be there. I'm doing this very simplistically. The second act is where we finally meet the aliens, and the third act is kind of the aftermath of that. And when I initially read this, I really liked the first 2 acts a lot. And then I think the words I used in my review was, I didn't like the third act at all. But that's changed because I don't think a week's gone by in the 2 years since I've read this that I haven't thought about this book, specifically the third act. Now, there was one aspect of the third act that I really loved. Non-spoiler reasons, but to give you a hint if you've read it, just basically the appearance of the aliens and what that meant. I really loved that side of it. That was something that I did like in the third act, but I didn't like where the story went. But there's a single line in this third act that I can't stop thinking about. And because of that line, it's made me rethink everything about this book, and especially made me rethink just my own reception about this book. So Childhood's End is probably a 5-star read for me. I understand the greatness of it, and I think in my haste to kind of give my thoughts, I didn't have time to think about it. I've come to learn through this book that kind of the more thought-provoking types of books, especially in science fiction, I need time to think about it and more time to digest. So, although this might not be a top 10 work of science fiction for me, it's definitely a 5-star read, and I was definitely wrong about it the first time. Second book I want to talk about is a book that I've never heard anybody else talk about on BookTube, and that is Forever by Pete Hamill. Now, I read this about 10 years ago, and back then I didn't have a BookTube channel or anything like that, and I had a GOODREADS. I don't know how much I used it, but I would always write at the end of the year my top 10 books that I read in the year, and I would put it on my Facebook. And this made my top 3 one year, despite earlier in that year me giving it only a 4-star rating. So Forever is a really interesting book. It's written by someone who's not a novelist. It's written by Pete Hamill, who is a New York City historian. And he's crafted this story to basically tell the story of New York City. And in this story, we get a 15th or 16th century Irishman who finds the keys to immortality, but he has to stay on the island of Manhattan. So it's this magical tale of seeing just Manhattan grow up around him. And it was one of those books that, although the ending I felt a little rushed, I really enjoyed it. And throughout the year, this was a book that, much like Childhood's End, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. So when I got to the end of that year, several months after I read it, it was no longer a 4-star read. It was a 5-star read, and it was one of the best things that I read all year. I don't know anybody that's read this, so go check it out. Forever by Pete Hamill. Great book. He also wrote a great small little biography of Frank Sinatra that I love called Why Sinatra Matters. Anyway, Forever by Pete Hamill is a book that I got wrong the first time. Now, the next 2 were some works that I read as a youth. One I just talked about recently in my classic fantasy video, so I'm going to be kind of brief with that. But When I was 12 years old, I read The Chronicles of Narnia and didn't really like it. Part of it was a 12-year-old that was kind of precocious that wanted something more grown up, which I discovered when the next book series I read was The Lord of the Rings. However, as an adult, going in and knowing that these were children's books and just knowing that they were going to be less serious and more whimsical, I really enjoyed them. You know, they wouldn't crack the top 10 of my favorite book series ever, but when I did a tier list of my fantasy series, and I put it in the mid tier, and it's definitely better than that. This is a good to great book series. It's whimsical, it skews young. My favorite one is the darkest one in the series, A Magician's Nephew, but it is one that, as a youth, I was wrong, and as an adult, I see that there's a lot of greatness in the Chronicles of Narnia. So another one that I got wrong as a youth. I read all of the works, not all of the works. I read like 4 works of Terry Brooks, the Sword of Shannara series, and then I remember reading the first one of the next series. And at the time, I loved the Sword of Shannara, and I didn't really like the other ones. Well, about 5 or 6 years ago, I reread the Shannara trilogy, and then I read the next series, The Heritage of Shannara. It's a tetralogy. And of those 7 books, without a doubt, the best of all of those books is one that I didn't like as a youth, and that's The Elfstones of Shannara. This is my original copy. Don't you miss fantasy covers like this? I do. Anyway, Elfstones is brilliant. It is the first time that Brooks kind of starts to stray away from, what the publishers wanted, which was basically another formulaic clone of Tolkien, which Sword of Shannara frankly was. And this went some really interesting directions, had some great characterization, and I thought was by far the best of all of the 7 Terry Brooks novels that I read a few years ago. I'm not reading any more of that author. I'm exploring other authors, but I still love this one. And this is one that I don't think I'll read any more of the Shannara series, but this is one I'll probably reread because I think this was a very strong entry in that series. And I think you could probably read it by itself. I don't think you have to endure through the 700 pages of Sword of Shannara to get to it. Not that it's bad, it's just formulaic and derivative. But Elfstones is where it's at for Terry Brooks as far as I'm concerned. So another one that I read as a youth, not quite as young as these other ones, but there's a classic that I read senior year in high school. We had to do an author study where we had to read 3 or more works of an author and find commonalities of theme and things like that within the author's works that you were going to read. And I chose George Orwell because I had wanted to read 1984 for quite some time. And one of the other things that I read by Orwell was Animal Farm. And at the time, I loved 1984. That opinion has not changed, but I didn't like Animal Farm at all. And I reread these, I don't know, it's been within 5 years, and I think this is a better book. I honestly do. It's a lesson on concise storytelling, and it's a strong allegory, and all the way to the last, it has one of those most memorable last sentences of a book you'll ever read. But of the 2 books, this is the one I thought about a lot more than the other. And again, I still love 1984, but Animal Farm is fantastic. My next top 10 video, I don't know when I'll do it. I keep promising these and then I don't get around to them. But my next top 10 video will be my top 10 favorite classics. And I have a strong suspicion Animal Farm is going to be on that list. So I was wrong about Animal Farm. So there's another classic I was wrong about, and this one was not me reading this as an 18-year-old, but about 10 years ago, I read Crime and Punishment for the first time. This was one of my earliest reads in Russian literature, and a friend said, read it. It's one of the greatest works of literature, full stop. And I read it, and this is the version I read, and I liked it. When I told my friend that I liked it, I got a look like I had slapped his child. And then he asked, which translation did you read? And it was the Constance Garnett. Now, before I go further, if you love the Constance Garnett translation, good for you. Keep reading it. Awesome. I'm happy for you. It didn't work for me. So he recommended another translation. He said it's worth it. And then he quoted a passage from the book where he quoted the 2 different translations because he has a brain like that. And he quoted this different translation, which I picked up by Richard Pavir and Larissa Volohansky, Crime and Punishment. By virtue of this reread with a different translator, not only did this become one of my favorite classics, but it became one of my favorite books of all time. And I'm glad I had that experience because it really showed me that the translator of translated fiction is so, so important that you choose the right one. And for me, I just needed a more modern translation. And if you say that, the modern translations aren't as good, I was reminded when I read, there was a new translation of The Tin Drum by GOODREADS, and it was the 30th anniversary of that book. And he got together new translators from all across the world for all these different languages that they were going to translate it into. And something he said that really stuck with me was that each generation, there are changes in the language. So works, if they're going to be read in a different language, probably need to be updated by a translation. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm using him as a source to support my argument that you need to pick the right translation for you. I do enjoy the Pavir and Volhansky translations. I've read dozens of them in Russian literature at this point. And I'm glad that I discovered it because I didn't love the Constance Garnett version. I still liked it, but I absolutely loved this translation. So Crime and Punishment, I'm glad I gave it a second shot because it is one of my favorite works of all time. And last but certainly not least, I'm going to upset one of the sacred cows of fantasy booktube. There are 3 sacred cows in fantasy booktube that you can't talk ill about or else people are going to come at you. You can't talk ill about Malazan, you can't talk ill about Sanderson, and you can't talk ill about Harry Potter. And I'm going to talk ill about Harry Potter. I had to include at least one book on this list where my reception went the other direction. And the book that went the other direction for me is Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Initially, I really enjoyed it because, like most people, I was just excited that it was out. I read it really quick. I read it in like 2 days. I remember reading the last 500 pages in one sitting just to find out what happens of this big series that's been beloved and going on for a long time. I still love the series. I still think there's a lot of greatness in this series, but the finale as a whole, I think disappointed me on quite a few levels. I will not begin with even talking about the worst part of this finale, which is that steaming bag of excrement called the epilogue. I won't even mention that. But there were 2 narrative choices in this finale that the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it just wasn't very strong. And she missed some opportunities for a couple reasons. Hate to be negative, so I'll try to be brief. The first one is, and hey, this is spoilers. This book is way old, very popular. There's movies, so if you don't want to be spoiled for number 7, click to the end of the video. But Harry Potter 7, here are just 2 reasons why I didn't think it was a very strong finale. Number 1, narrative choices. For so long in this book, we have Ron and Harry and Hermione just kind of lost in the woods. Harry's ruffling his brow because he doesn't know what a Horcrux is, and Hermione's ruffling her brow as she reads her book for the 70th time, and Ron's ruffling his brow because he's just a walking bag of inferiority complex. Anyway, we got like interminable chapters about that. And then we find out, like at Hogwarts, we got Neville and Ginny, and all the kids are fighting back. Dumbledore's army is like reassembled, and they're fighting back against Snape and the rest of them. Like, why couldn't we get more of that? That would have been amazing. And the other aspect of this book that was a bit lousy for me is that you can't make an omelet without cracking a few eggs. It was quite obvious that this was an author writing in fear, and she couldn't kill anybody of note. And I know this is still like YA fantasy, and YA fantasy is all about wish fulfillment. But I thought as the series progressed and got progressively more adult, starting in the 4th book, culminating in the 6th book, which I think is the finest in the series, I thought that she would have the guts to have a stronger ending. I was talking with an author friend recently, and he said something that stuck with me, which applies to this, and that is, if you kill a character that nobody cares about, you didn't really kill a character. And that's what happened in this book. All of the deaths in this book are characters that nobody really care about. And someone's screaming, Fred or George or whichever one died. I don't know, because I found both of those characters the same and interchangeable in the series. So you still have one of them. So that's not a huge loss there. I really think she should have killed Ron when he found the Sword of Gryffindor. Would have been a heroic ending for him to have drowned, getting this Horcrux. It would have changed my whole perspective on the character. Or something. There's just so many. I mean, I can rant more about this book. I mean, the villains just end up being milquetoast and weak in this book. But the more I thought about this book, the more I realized I think it was a missed opportunity, and I think it was a weak conclusion to what was otherwise a very good book series that I've read twice, and I'll probably read it again. I still love the Harry Potter books, even despite the things wrong with this. And if you want a rant video about the epilogue, don't ask. I don't like to bring a lot of negativity into the world, but that epilogue, I could go on for days. Anyway, those are 7 books that I admit I was wrong. I'd love to hear any books that you've had that experience where over time you realized it wasn't as good as you thought, or it was a lot better than you thought. Please let me know in the comments section below. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.